Okay, great. Well, we'd like to thank Gila Irene for helping us out and providing us space. It's really great. We look forward to potentially partnering this summer and beyond. And beyond and beyond and beyond. And so we thank you for this space. And what Gila does to the community is really fantastic. So, hopefully it's
Thank you.
yeah. Wala Lipa.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm Preston Davis, and it's a real pleasure to be here. I am a professor at Alma Mater Europaea, and also the director of the Global Center for Advanced Studies. And we are all researchers at the Global Center for Advanced Studies. It's based in New York. What we call GCAS. So Zachary, Nathan, and David are all students at Alma Mater pursuing their PhDs. They're also researchers at the Global Center for Advanced Studies. And we're really pleased. Tonight's forum is entitled, Is Philosophy Bullshit? That's the question that we're entertaining. And we're entertaining that with respect to three intersections between, say, Wall Street, its relationship to the media, and how the media has in most, I think, in my opinion, the media has capitulated to what we would call post-truth conditions, and so that's the second one, media, and then the third intersection that we're looking at is truth, or truths, which is precisely what philosophy attempts to seek out and try to articulate in various ways. So come on, Nina! Yay! Nina! Nina, come and have a seat. So we're having a GCAS hangout. No, it's great. Yeah, it's fantastic. The tango's right around there. It's fantastic. So Mina is also a PhD student. She did her master's degree at Trinity College Dublin, and she's from Ankara, Turkey. And Mina is here with us, and it's fantastic. Part of what we're doing here is made possible by Gila, but also Risk Change, the project. And Risk Change looks at and tries to figure out through aesthetic forms and in conversation, tries to figure out what it means to be on the move, immigration. We know that there's a huge crisis in immigration that's happening. And there are sets of questions behind what launched the immigration, especially from the Middle East, and in particular Syria, and Afghanistan, and Iran, and Iraq in particular. I actually had the chance of working at the first aid Red Cross, leading Red Cross, for a month last October in 2016, or no, 2015, working with refugees from Syria and elsewhere. So that was really impacted me. So Risk Change is a project that looks at and examines what it means in relationship to the space and the community. So it's a really important question to start asking, what are the causes of immigration? U.S. imperialism, certainly one cause, destabilizing the Middle East, providing all kinds of fear because of foreigners moving in. And what do we do with that fear? Do we close down our walls and fortify Europe? Or do we open ourselves up in a humanitarian way because we're all one in humanity? So these are questions that I think have geopolitically played into Brexit and played into Trump's rise to power in the United States. And so the trend has been isolationism, nationalism, racism, fascism has been on the rise. And so it's really important, I think, to identify those factors and how they play into spaces like this, community spaces, education, and ultimately what it means to be a human being, to be alive and to be moving in and out of spaces. I would like to think that we are all humans and that we can figure out ways of being together and so on. So I would like to introduce our speakers. I'll say a few more words. I know I'm boring, but I should have a bullshit joke in my. I know it's total bullshit. Which is we're doing philosophy, so maybe the answer is yes to the proposition. But yeah, so I'll introduce our speakers, and you can, because we're here, you can say a few words. Because the proposition tonight is philosophy bullshit? And by bullshit, it was funny because T.S. Eliot is identified as being the first person to write the word bullshit in English, and he didn't publish the poem, but it was called something like, actually I have the title here, T.S. Eliot, the Concise Oxford English Dictionary is in fact says that it mentions the earliest attestation to the word bullshit is from T.S. Eliot, who between 1910 and 1916 wrote an early poem to which he gave the title The Triumph of Bullshit. And bullshit has an interesting etymology, which we'll talk about. Maybe you can lead that or whatever, but it's an interesting way in which the word came to rise in the English world. We in fact have the etymology sitting with us now. So let me introduce the speakers, and then we'll just go around, and then we'll have a conversation. So the first speaker tonight will be David Steinruck from San Francisco, California. And David is doing his PhD in philosophy and humanities. And so he'll speak first. Then we'll go to Zachary Isaru from Chicago. He did his master's at the University of Chicago and is doing his PhD in philosophical anthropology. And then we'll go from Zachary to Nathan Wiley, who is from Philadelphia. And Nathan did his undergraduate degree in a liberal arts college in Pennsylvania, and went abroad in Japan and knows Japanese and studied Japanese and taught there in Japan for many years. And so he is with us as well. And then we'll follow up with Mina, who will say a few jokes for us and do a tango dance for us. So that would be really great. And I mentioned earlier, Mina, education. So yeah. You're writing your PhD on state power and its relationship to what? I forget. State. Yeah. So how the state uses control law to control thought, ideas. So Althusser and Polizotz play into this. Good. All right. So we'll go with David.
Thanks, Preston. I want to thank Irina and Kibla also for inviting us here, and for what I hope is a longer collaboration. We're also doing our summer institute, maybe partly in this space and partly in the other space, and I'm really excited as part of our mission as a school to be able to collaborate with spaces outside the classroom. And this has to do with the question, is philosophy bullshit? Also because we're really trying to bring it down to critique this high-level philosophical thinking and bring it down to the street level, I guess I would say. So it's a core part of our mission to be collaborating in different spaces on the street, in open spaces where we can have a beer and hang out at the bar and talk with each other. And so thank you so much for inviting us here. Well, first of all, philosophy is something that you can do while taking a shit. I'm going to be a little bit vulgar here, but it's true because I wrote these notes. I wrote these notes in a bathroom stall, but so they're a little scribbled out, but I'll go through them. Yes, thoroughly.
That's all I need to know.
Yeah. So I'll respond. I'll unload a little bit, and then I'll defer to questions. Hopefully, just open up the conversation. So, is philosophy bullshit? As in, I took this as in the question: is philosophy like literally bullshit? Like, is it the excrement coming out of a bull? Okay. So this was the question for me. Like, to what extent is philosophy literally bullshit? Okay. And of course, so I have to go through my notes here because otherwise I get terribly sidetracked in this very confusing conversation.
Thank you, David.
Okay. So, and furthermore, what's the difference then between bullshit and a cow pie, let's say? Okay, so this was my immediate follow-up question. Is philosophy bullshit, and then what's the difference between bullshit and a cow pie? Okay, this was like, yeah, like one from out of a female cow or a male bull, you know? Okay, so but let's back up for a minute. So the question is, what is bullshit? Because is bullshit even this excrement that we're talking about? And well, no, bullshit is a concept. It's a condensed word, and we were talking about concepts earlier, so Zachary was going to laugh, and we'll tear this apart, but we'll have a conversation about it. So no, bullshit it's a concept, and concepts are things that we create. So how could it literally be this bullshit? And I'll just link that to philosophy. A lot of the philosophy we read, as Deleuze and Guattari would define it, philosophy has the task of creating concepts. So it's this, what we're doing in our school is creating a concept. So what is a concept? Let's go one step back further. Well, a concept is a way of defining a boundary, okay? So the role of a philosopher is to look at the world and decide where boundaries should be formed, or to create new boundaries between things. And more specifically, to think about the way that moral boundaries can be formed. So if we're looking at like Derrida, people like this, the whole question is how can we ethically consume and impose ourselves and be fed by others, where we're establishing our own boundaries through the consumption of the other. But we have to figure out a way to delimit or to mark ourselves off so that we're not imposing on the other or creating violence onto the other. So this, let's just say, is the role I'm going to propose that philosophy takes on. It's the creative act of defining boundaries between different things, okay? So this is the role of philosophy. So then I have two questions. So what is the relation of, in this context of concepts to the bullshit itself, to get back to this? And second, I just went over what is a concept. So this is a concept. So what is the connection then between, as we put it, this demarcation of a concept and the bull itself, or the bullshit, okay? It's going somewhere, I think, I hope, I don't know. Okay, this is all bullshit anyway. Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so there's 2 points that I came up with that I'll propose. And one is that if you think about what bullshit really is, it's in the physical sense, okay? It's an excrement that's literally coming out of the bull. So the bull is deciding, he's defining itself through what stays inside of the bowl and what is excreted out of the bowl. So this is the definition, is to make finite, to make finite. So the bowl is in the act of bullshitting, defining itself and what it takes in from the world around it and what it gives out and says, this is not me. So this is the act, you could say, of the bullshit, okay? In the sense of creating concepts of itself within the world. Okay? So that's the first point. So the second is that I guess we could say that if the role of philosophy is in demarcating boundaries, and the role of the bull shitting is also demarcating boundaries, and the word itself is a demarcation or a concept, we can definitely conclude that philosophy is bullshit in all levels of the word, physical and conceptual, okay? And then just the follow-up question that I was going over with Zachary that will maybe provoke a response from him is that then we have to think about to what degree is a concept or is philosophy in the world? To what degree is how we conceptualize things? To what degree is that a physical act, we could say? Or not even just physical, but in the world. And does in the world mean only physical? So, and if it doesn't, then there's a lot of power in how we choose to create and define and create these limits that do define the world, that are creative acts of how we ethically interact with each other. So that's my answer. Yeehaw!
Are we moving on to Zach here now, or?
Do you want to respond to the responses?
No, let's go through it first and then we can respond.
Okay, so we're doing fine. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, great. Thank you, David, for that excellent delimitation of this idea of bullshit. Taken in a very literal sense, which is great.
Air is thick with bullshit right now. You could cut it with a knife.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I don't
No,
know.
but it's good. We're keeping our notes. That's creative.
Great. So I'm gonna take a little bit of a different route here, a little bit more theoretical, a little less literal. But I think I'm gonna tackle some of the same issues here. So first, let's go through the obvious question here: is philosophy bullshit? So first, let's define philosophy and define this bullshit in a less literal way. So philosophy, right? Looking at the etymology, it's easier. Philos, Sophia, right? Love of wisdom. As David pointed out, it can also be interpreted as this method by which we create concepts. There's a lot of different ways to think of philosophy, but we take it in the very literal, etymological sense of love of wisdom, as wisdom seekers are philosophers, right? Bullshit, on the other hand, looking back in maybe about a decade ago or so, a guy by the name of Harry Frankfurt wrote an essay called On Bullshit, if anybody remembers that. It was about a decade ago, 2005, which later he turned into a book, I can't remember. But in this essay, Dr. Frankfurt seeks to define bullshit in distinction from lying. And he says the liar is the individual who knowingly tells something false, whereas the bullshitter has zero care about the truth value of the statements they make. And this is the distinction between the bullshitter and the liar, right? So the liar has the care about the truth value of the statements because they have to say what they know is false. The bullshitter doesn't, right? So if we take it in this regard, that is the question, is philosophy bullshit? I think we have to answer no, right? Because if we are wisdom seekers, if we are truth lovers, we do have a genuine concern about the value or the truth value that is of the claims that we make. So I don't think we can be bullshitters in philosophy. However, I think that raises a different question that we should be discussing, and that's, does that mean that philosophy is relevant? Or, to state differently, does that mean we should take philosophy seriously? Just because we are not bullshitters in philosophy, does that mean we should be taken literally and or seriously? And so this is the question that I would like to address here. So when we look at the history and the development of philosophy throughout the years, I like to look at it as a game or as a joke. So maybe not bullshit, but certainly not something that we should be taking seriously. And let me explain, because this can be controversial considering I am studying philosophy. But let me explain. Throughout the history of philosophy, I believe a case can be made that regardless of the views and the arguments made, almost every philosopher, almost every philosophical text, in fact, argues precisely the same thing. And that they can all be broken down so that there is no distinction between the various philosophies. And I think that this is what the game is. The game is to hide behind language that makes and expresses difference, but to underneath the difference, articulate the same thing and speak only to those who are trained to understand what you are talking about. And so I think this is the game. Now, let's see how this works. Let's take, for example, ethical theories, something that is a little bit more widely discussed than just something like metaphysics or epistemology. We'll take ethics. Several of the standard views of ethics, virtue ethics, like Aristotelian ethics, deontological ethics, like Kantianism, utilitarianism, like in Mill, right? And then we can sort of pull out an ethics from Nietzsche, right? In sort of his genealogy of morals, or in Beyond Good and Evil. So this sort of nihilistic ethics that I think we can take out. So when we look at these, they're all saying something very different. But I think if we break them down, we'll see that they're all saying the same thing. So let's do that. In virtue ethics with Aristotle, the goal, right, the ethical thing to do is to hit a mean, right, between an excess and deficiency of any one virtue. So take courage, for example. Courage, the virtue of courage, is a mean between the excess of rashness, where you have zero fear and you just rush headstrong into things, and cowardice, where you're too scared to take on anything. And courage is this very, very fine point right in the middle. But there's a little bit of a catch. It's not quite as simple as hitting the mean, because the mean is ever changing. It changes based on situation, it changes on person, changes on your perception of the situation. So it changes on a whole bunch of different levels every single time. So it's not good enough either for Aristotle to hit the mean one time. You have to do it consistently, every action throughout your entire life. And only then can you be considered virtuous. Now, with deontological ethics, Kantian ethics, the ethical thing to do in a situation is action which corresponds to the categorical imperative, which states that the maximum of your action can be willed to become a universal law, right? Which means it should be the action that everyone does in the same situation that you find yourself in, right? For example, stealing cannot be, right? Kant talks about this, where he says that if everyone were to steal, private property would be invalid, so therefore you can't actually will yourself to steal, because it would be the unethical thing to do. Okay. Utilitarian ethics says the right action is the action that increases the greatest utility, or the greatest happiness among the greatest number of people. At least this is maximizing utilitarianism. Okay. Any action which would not do this, or would increase more pain than happiness, is the wrong action. So let's break these three down, because Nietzsche, I think, and a lot of nihilistic ethics would argue that there is no morality generally. But I think we can break down these other three ethical theories to say that there is no ethics as well. And I'm going to do that right now. So Aristotle, and then I'm going to come back to why this plays into this game. It'll be quick, I promise. It'll be quick. It sounds like a lot, but I'm going to keep it quick.
It doesn't sound like bullshit.
It's not. It's certainly not bullshit, like I said, but it's a game and it's a joke and not to be taken seriously, right? Because this sounds like this is a serious topic, right? Ethics, and we're saying, look, this is what one should do in a situation, and we think we should take these ethical theories very seriously. You know, for example, deontological ethics. I'm going to show why we shouldn't, and that's because they're actually articulating that there is no ethics. So, for example, in deontological ethics, we can do. Deontological ethics is a very good theory insofar as it allows you to, insofar as it requires one that has reason, right? It applies to anything that has and uses reason. But insofar as it applies to anything without reason, it doesn't really work very well, right? Also, it allows for a lot of different situations to arise that are perhaps what we would consider unethical. So it sort of contradicts itself in many, many different instances. For example, and I've mentioned this before, but if someone comes to your house and asks for your best friend to go murder them, Kant would say you can't lie and you have to tell them where your friend is, because you know. So you couldn't lie. Right. So in any situation, you know, and there's no situation in which you could justify stealing or anything like this. But as we know from life it gets more complex than this. It's not black and white. And so deontological ethics, I think, can be broken down insofar as when you remove reason, right? When you remove the fact that it only applies to beings that have reason, I think what that shows is there is no objective ethics. There is no objectively moral thing to do. It's very, very particular. That is morality is. So if we go to utilitarianism, right, I think it does the same thing. It's a very good ethical theory insofar as you exist within a society. If you remove yourself from society, utilitarian ethics don't work. So again, I think what it shows is that there is no objective morality that can take place or that it can exist without the construct around it. So I think when you look at these different philosophies, like I said, they're all saying the same thing, and that's in this case, like I was
Because
saying.
the mean keeps shifting, there's no alcohol.
Oh yeah, and in virtue ethics, it would be because the mean keeps shifting. That and Aristotle even points this out, right? He says right in the Nicomachean Ethics, right, that it's really not possible to be a virtuous person, right? I mean, he says the only way that you can be labeled as such is for after you die, for people to look back on your life and say, yeah, he was happy, he was virtuous, right? But so you can never actually be virtuous because you're already dead at that point, right? And so I think these are all really articulating the same thing. And like in the case of ethics that I just went through, I think what they're arguing is that there's no morality. And we could do this for epistemological theories, we could do this for metaphysical theories, and I think they're all saying the same thing. But to get back to this idea of truth and post-truth and bullshit, like I said, I don't think we're bullshitting. I think because we do have a care for what's true, but at the same time, I think that the truth is something that should not always be known. And that raises a moral epistemological question about truth-seeking in general, right? Should we be doing philosophy? Is the truth something that should, in fact, be known? And I think that that's something we should discuss, because I'm not so sure that it is. Is I think that the truth, for example, morality, if there's no morality, society breaks down, right? We fall into chaos. And so the game of philosophy, I think, is to keep society running and to talk only to those who are trained to read through and to pick out and break down and deconstruct these ideas so that we can get to the truth behind the text. Because I don't think the texts articulate the truth very straightforward to the general readers. So for me, I think the post-truth era is a bit misguided in the sense that I don't think we can get beyond the truth, and I don't think that we should get beyond the truth.
And the next guest is Nathan.
All right, well, I have the pleasure of being the first respondent, which is cool, but also daunting because there's so much that's been said here. So I'm not going to respond to, there's lots to respond to in what Zachary said, I think, but since it was David's talk that initially triggered my train of thought, I'm going to respond to that and leave it to you guys to talk about some of the things, very interesting things that Zachary brought up. But what struck me about what David was saying was this idea of bullshit as metabolic in a certain sense. You have this practice of the philosopher of creating concepts. And anytime you create concepts, you're looking at the world and you're setting up different boundaries. And you choose what to keep in and what is excreted out, what is bullshit. And so that act of bullshitting is constitutive of the philosophical act itself. So all philosophy is bullshit in that sense. It's metabolic. It has to do with exchange. An ethical exchange, too, of consumption and excreting of one another. When we converse, when we give our words to one another, we share our feelings with one another, whatever it might be, write texts and publish them, in journals, then we're engaged in a sort of exchange. So this idea of philosophy and bullshit as a mode of exchange interests me with respect to the intersection that Creston articulated, in particular two of the three, one being how truth is sort of controlled by an elite few who broker power over media outlets and what gets disseminated as truth, and then what is truth telling. And when I first heard about the topic from Mina yesterday, the first thing that I thought about was Kojin Karatani's text on the structure of world history. And I was just looking over it because I wanted to revisit some of the points he was making, because that's what I was thinking of.
Who is that guy? Could you just tell me?
And Kojin Karatani is a critical theorist, a literary theorist. He studied, I think, with Paul de Man, and he wrote a book that influenced Slavoj Žižek. His book is the book that influenced Žižek. It's called Transcritique, right? And this is where Žižek gets the idea of a parallax gap, which he articulates in the parallax view. But following the Transcritique, where he reads Kant and Marx together with one another in an interesting way, he wrote this book called The Structure of World History, subtitled From Modes of Production to Modes of Exchange, where he argues that critical theory should be less focused on modes of production and more focused on modes of exchange. And it's interesting, he talks about the economy of the gift and how there are different modes of exchange. And in our contemporary bourgeois democracy, we have a mode of exchange that's sort of fits with representative bourgeois democracy, which is where everything is highly regulated and controlled. And he cites ancient Ionian culture, pre-Athens culture, as a potential source for where we might come up with a different mode of exchange to supersede our present mode of exchange. And so he says that in ancient Ionian culture there was a different metabolism at work. This is where Homer wrote his epics. This is where the pre-Socratic philosophers hail from, Thales and others. Or not all of them, but Thales and some others. And the idea is that in this society, this society, geographically, they're on the submargins of the empires of the time. And as such, they had a relationship to the core, which was very bureaucratic, heavily controlled, where truth was sort of defined by the power brokers. But on the submargins, they had more mobility. They were often maritime societies, seafaring people, and this is where the market originates as well. But he also makes the point that they're nomadic cultures, and with nomadic cultures, there's a lot of traveling that takes place, and you have to travel lightly, and so that it's given to a certain mode of exchange where you pool together your resources and then immediately distribute them all equally among those who are there. There's no accumulation that takes place, in other words. And so this is ideas form here. This is where great ideas develop, and where where new ideas form and open up different possibilities for worlds. And so, just as a side note to reflect, I think a lot of us here are nomadic in that sense, and GCAS is representative of people who live that kind of lifestyle, who are interested in the ideas and in that kind of metabolic exchange of ideas. But also it's very material too. It also has to do with how the actual economy functions, to tie it in with that. And within this concept of, in ancient Ionia, this was known as, and Hannah Arendt also talks about this, is isonomia. It's like a more democratic, pre-Athenian democracy political form of politics and form of society. And it has a certain mode of exchange that's very interesting. So, but within isonomia, there's this principle called parrhesia, truth-telling. And they had, in ancient Athens, they had, the elites would come together and they would, all men, wealthy men, like among them Aristotle, would come together and decide things. But in ancient Ionia, truth, and they would dictate what the truth was and what got implemented in society. But in ancient Ionia, according to the principle of Parrhesia, the truth tellers are the ones, or is anybody. It's completely open across the board because there's no hierarchy that's established because they're all nomadic people. And so they all have equal authority. There are no rules that are in place for who has the power to speak the truth. Anybody can. Whoever is recognized as speaking the truth is considered to be speaking the truth, no matter what gender, no matter what race. So I think that's an interesting way to tie it into the political aspects that Creston brought up. But I also wanted to tie it into this idea of philosophy as a practice of establishing borders and whether or not philosophy is bullshit. And in a sense, David's point was that philosophy is bullshit to the extent that it establishes borders. But with this mode of exchange where the borders are less relevant, where you're more one, you're more like pulling together, you're more belonging to the same clan, then there's more blending, there are fewer borders. And this gets back to how Creston opened the whole conversation in part, when he referenced immigration and borders and this issue of borders. And even the practice of philosophy, and it's being founded on demarcating differences and establishing borders, is being called into question in some contemporary trends like anti-philosophical trends, non-philosophical trends. And I think these are interesting because if philosophy is bullshit to the extent that it establishes a metabolism that has strict borders, then maybe we need an anti-philosophy, maybe we need a non-philosophy, maybe accompanying that we need a nomadism with a different kind of mode of exchange that'll usher in a different kind of politics, a different way of thinking, and new kinds of ideas. So I would recommend Koji Karatani's The Structure of World History for thinking about this issue further.
That's great. Thank you, Nathan. Yeah, David's going to respond.
And we'll want to respond to Zach too. Well, I'll just to respond to that. Hello. Yeah, I'm just not talking loud enough. But just in defense of boundaries, I want to say that if you look at bullshit, it's in that demarcation process. The shit is literally is a fertilizer. I mean, here's the Lion King story, you know, and like that goes into the ground and grows the grass that feeds the cow to shit it out. And like if there was no demarcation process, you can see that. I mean, we see this also obviously across philosophy as a new form of violence where you're eliminating boundaries. And if there's only cows walking around, everybody dies. So like this process of demarcation, of boundary making, is life-giving. And I mean, I think Heidegger would say the same thing, where a boundary is an opening, or whatever the fuck he says. So it's the beginning. A boundary is a beginning that makes things possible. So I just want to throw that out there in response that,
And I'll just add to that. I mean, it's interesting too because your position seems to favor of the two possibilities of identity and difference. It starts with identity, but then it deconstructs identity in terms of boundaries with a deterritorialization or difference. And of course, Deleuze is a deterritorializer. So I really liked. I thought it was creative how you assess the cow or the cow. And, I mean, that's creative because philosophy is about creating concepts, but the creation of concepts isn't about creating another identity per se. It's I think the creation of something new is precisely the thinking of even a difference from identity in order to create a new form of identity. So there's a kind of process, a dialectical process between identity and difference, or representation and deterritorialization, something like that.
Yeah.
Mina,
If I could also just say something in response to David's response, I agree. I think setting up boundaries is important, and I don't think we want to do away with boundaries. I think it's chaotic. But we need to rethink what borders are and what boundaries are, and think them as permeable in different ways in this process of deterritorialization, re-territorialization. But I don't know, and with respect to thinking from identity to difference, I think we need to think more to identity from difference in this post-truth era in order to arrive at a point that I think Zachary has an intuition that we need to arrive at. And not to totalize or to turn everything to an identity, but to rethink what identity is from a baseline heterogeneity, a baseline difference.
Yeah, it's important, I think, to have this couch this discussion. Sorry, Zachary. Thanks. It's important, I think, to couch this discussion in what's going on, say, in Europe, with the deterritorialization or nomadicity of people being displaced from their homes as a result of a destabilizing soft war, really created by, say, Russia and the United States over interests like oil, over interest in the region for natural resources, and now suddenly you have this movement of differences, and this scares the shit out of people, which is why Europe has turned to the right and politically you'll have the arguments of like, I'm of a Slovenian race, or I'm of a certain country, and this is the way it should be. Which, of course, if you look slightly beyond that veneer, you see that in fact people are mixtures of all kinds of different possibilities. So this idea of thinking from identity to difference and back, I think should be thought in relationship to at least things that are going on around us, such as the immigration into Europe and what's happening in Turkey, this authoritarianist this turn that's happening in all spaces now. So yeah, I think it's important to start to ground these concepts in examples of that for me. Yeah. And now Zachary.
Awesome. So I just have a comment more so, and it's sort of unrelated, but so you were mentioning ancient Ionia and culture and this sort of this truth culture that they sort of had going on, and one thing that's interesting about that, and it's been a little while since I've visited the pre-Socratics or ancient Ionian culture, but the interesting thing for me about that is that whole truth teller culture sort of predates philosophy generally, right? Thales, who was from Miletus in ancient Ionia, was actually responding to this culture, was trying to get out of this culture. So it's interesting to see how philosophy emerges as a way of rejecting this truth culture, and so relating that to what you were talking about, I think that opens up the question again of philosophy being bullshit, in the sense that are we and its relationship to truth telling, it's a way of sort of limiting who can tell the truth, in a sense, and it's the individual who can use reason and use tight logic, argumentation, and all the other great stuff. But it's interesting for me to see how philosophy emerges out of this truth teller culture that you were talking about. So.
And it's interesting too, maybe not necessarily a question of who can use reason and logic and how compelling that is, but getting back to Deleuze and Guattari and what is philosophy, there's compelling statements. I just reread the text not long ago, where they state that philosophy has nothing to do with truth.
Philosophy what?
Philosophy has nothing to do with truth.
Right.
It's about how compelling it is. It's how interesting it is.
Yeah.
Similarly, in ancient Ionia, this practice of parousia, truth-telling, as it translates, doesn't necessarily have anything to do with truth, but it has to do with how compelling it is. And so you have...
And bullshit is pretty compelling.
And bullshit is always the most compelling.
Like, it's entertaining.
Yeah,
It's gold to the ears.
it is.
Yes, as long as you wash your hands.
Yeah, and in that vein, just to respond to what you were saying, Zachary, about truth can only be known, or truth should not be known by all, or something like that. Is that your statement?
Yeah, we might not want everyone
we might not want everyone to know the truth. And I guess my response to that with what Nathan was just saying, with it has to be compelling or interesting, or I would take that to be engaging or acting or something like that. This word truth for me is tricky, and the way I view it, truth that's not known is not truth, or truth that's, if you're trying to hold something back, it can't be the truth. It has to be acted out or interesting or compelling or engaging to be the truth. Because what is something that is consistently held back from what? It doesn't exist in any meaningful sense, or is it even is it relevant? I guess I would say. And for me, truth has to be relevant. And maybe this is what they mean by interesting. It has to be relevant to the moment. And if you're saying that truth has to be held, in some instances, held back or not known by everyone, then I feel like it's a pretty shitty truth, or it's not a truth at all. Or
Not a shitty truth. It's not a bullshit truth.
It's definitely not bullshit. And what you're outlining isn't bullshit. And that's why I think there is, and your conclusion was that philosophy is not bullshit. So I do find there's an interesting take on this where.
Well, what do you make, David? Just kind of responding to you're saying that hey, about truth has to be known for it to be true, right? It has to be expressive and convincing. But what would you say to this idea that we're as human beings, we grow, we have different relationships, we go deeper into some relationships and grow less, more shallow in others, and through a process of experience in the world, and through that process, the truths that we hold dear to us at one time, T1, like now, might not be truths that we hold dear.
Boom! I win!
Right? Why? Did you have a bet? Did you have a bet that I would say this?
No.
Okay, great. I feel like I'm in a family. Great. But it's a process of unfolding, right? So like when you have some experience of like falling in love, and then that experience fades.
Yeah.
And truth, in my mind, truth is this kind of dialectical unfolding elusivity that we sometimes encounter.
Yeah.
And other times, most times, we're not in connection with, or it seems far from us. And philosophy, I think, is precisely, at the peril of philosophers, is precisely that attempt to pin truth down. So, for example, Hegel, right, the dialectic of history and so on. It's an attempt to isolate and identify truth. Certainly it was the case with the positivists 100 years ago in Vienna, just up the road, right? Where they made a rule between what's sense and what's nonsense.
Yeah.
And what's nonsense is precisely bull, from the etymology. Bull is, it actually comes from, it's one version is it comes from this commander in World War I, a British commander that was more concerned with the appearance of a soldier than with war making. And so the Australians that showed up on the ground would say, look, he's full of bull, like it's baloney, or bollocks. And in that sense, right, bull is this pretense, not caring for truth, whereas a lie is caring for truth, but purposefully deceiving. And so, for me, anyway, truth is that a kind of that journey of unfolding through our time-space with our finite finitude, attempting to grasp, like an artwork will reveal an opening within a Heideggerian sense of something that takes you aback, to use Gadamer, like Dasace, to be called back, like, whoa, you take a breath, like, oh my God, right, that's hit you.
Yeah.
But then at other times it's very elusive. You try it, which is why I get off on philosophy, right? That's why I read it all the time, because I want that adrenaline rush.
Yeah, this idea of truth being a kind of opening relates to what David was saying about it being expressive and
Yeah.
What I was saying about it being compelling
Yes.
in one way or another.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, this ties back too in his book Signs and Machines, Maurizio Lazzarato. In the final chapters there, he also brings up parousia, truth-telling, in the ancient Ionian context. And he talks about how there are different practices. He talks about the Cynics and how they had different expressive practices, non-philosophical practices. And he recommends using these as a model for what we might do to create a rupture in in contemporary society where there's a monopoly on truth and where a power-broken few control what truth is and how it gets disseminated. And creating this rupture, creating this opening, creating this space, he references the cynics who, among other examples, he gives the example of them defecating in the streets as an expressive act that creates this sort of moment of parousia, this rupture of truth-telling, which I think is interesting because, for obvious
That's
reasons.
why Zizek doesn't take showers.
Is that why?
Yeah.
Maybe we should. But anyway, I think we should probably all maybe consider defecating in the streets and
Yeah.
in order to put our bullshit into practice.
Yes, we'll wrap it up then.
Yeah, so I just want to respond to this, this dialectic, I suppose, of truth and what David was saying about knowing truth.
I changed my position.
Well, that was at T1, now it's T2.
Yeah.
So you changed
Yeah, he's allowed to do.
Am I a relativist now?
No, you're yeah, I guess. Yeah, kind of. Anyway, and then I also responded to David about people having to know the truth. So I mean, regarding people having to know truth, I don't think truth requires any sort of knowledge. I mean, I think you have to know something for it to be true. I don't think you have to know the truth, right? Something can be true without you knowing it, right?
How did I change my position?
You're still you wanted.
No, your position because you started what you were saying by saying that we had a discussion about whether or not truth evolves, whether or not truth itself evolves, and you started by saying that truth is this dialectical, evolving process, but then you finished by saying it's something that through dialectic we are exposed to more and more, which would mean that it's just ever
There
in
is
one
something
place,
there
that there's one truth, versus that it's an evolving truth along with the situation. So maybe you can respond, but maybe you can clarify your views on that.
But anyway, just as a question to raise in response to David really quick before I can move on to reflecting to Creston's, is perhaps what you're getting at, or what I think you might want to get at instead of saying that people have to know the truth is an idea of some sort of like epistemic responsibility. Do the people who know the truth have some sort of responsibility to tell others the truth, rather than can it be truth if nobody knows it? I think that's yes. But now I think the question is about this sort of epistemic responsibility for the people who hold the truth. Are they now responsible morally to diverge this truth? But okay, anyway, so on to reflecting on this sort of dialectic truth and the changing truths. I think the tricky spot here is big T, little t, right? I mean, I think the changing are these small truths that I really think we're falsely giving them truth values. I don't think these things actually hold any truth values, because I think truth doesn't change. It's an unchanging. It's a static. It's an ultimate. It's a universal. It's an objective, right? But I think these small truths, these perhaps subjective truths, are things we should not be ascribing truth values to. Things like ethics.
What about feelings like love?
Yeah, I would call that not true.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And that to be said, I have a different view of love than you do.
Maybe,
so,
yeah.
I'm
glad I love you.
My view.
but you don't love me. That's okay. I can handle that.
My view of love is an ontological thing.
Right.
So I mean, for me, I would say love is truth.
But,
I
I
mean,
mean,
Zachary is just now calling every song written about love totally completely bullshit.
I am.
Yes.
Absolutely. It's complete bullshit. But yeah, so I think the issue here is we often talk about small truths,
yeah.
and we refer to them as being true. But I think this is a mistake, and I don't think the things that we typically ascribe truth to can be truth. I think that there's only one fundamental truth.
Right. I mean, like we're in this space, an art gallery, cafe, and you know, here's this great piece of art that is. It's interesting to ponder the nature of of art in relationship to bullshit, truth telling, and truth. Let's say, for me at least, art is something that breaks from the normal ways of thinking, the normal modes of being in the world, and it opens up something that that causes you to shift a perception in yourself in relationship to an event of art, something that breaks open. In that sense, it's very violent, for one. It troubles you because it forces you to change, to be sensitive to oneself, and it ultimately, and this is what art. This is why I decry, like, say, public art in America, where it's just this corporate thing that doesn't trouble anyone, for example. And in fact, it only keeps the modes of the situation intact and reproducing themselves. So when I say about truth is unfolding, and at the same time truth is maybe an end point, which is your position, right? I think that these two aren't contradictory. But I could, I'm willing to talk about that. But
I mean, it sounds very
Badooing to me.
yeah.
This idea of truth as an event, like an event of art, the event of falling in love, the event of having a thought that sends you reeling. It's a violence. And then the truth is precisely the remaining faithful to the event.
Yes.
It's the making it into a truth.
Yes.
It's the essentializing.
It's a force
It's a force.
and a decision.